Thank you, everyone who's joining. We're going to just give it another minute because it looks like we're slowly getting a bunch of attendees to join. So we'll just give it another minute for folks to join and then kick this off. Well, I think we can go ahead and kick this off. Thanks, everyone, for joining. I know we're going to continue getting more attendees as this goes by. So really excited to co-sponsor this learning lab on behalf of the SABA North America Foundation with SABA North America, as well as with NASALSA. My name is Tejas Shah, and I'm the president-elect of SABA North America Foundation. We're really fortunate to have a fantastic panel today to talk about this very important topic of free speech and campus unrest and how these issues are essentially related to each other. So we've got Sufyan Sohail today as our moderator. We're also fortunate to be joined by Amol Sinha, who is the executive director of the ACLU in New Jersey. We've got Mona Shah, who is the executive director of SABA North America and a lecturer at the USC Gould School of Law. And then we've got Ahilan Arulanantham, who is a professor at USC. So without further ado, I'm going to kick it over to Suf, who's going to lead us as the moderator.
Thanks, Tejas. Good afternoon, Sufyan Sohail here. So why are we here? Pro-Palestinian demonstrations and sit-ins have spread at universities across the United States and to campuses around the world. Columbia University in New York emerged as the center for student activism since Israel's war on Gaza and Hamas's attack on Israel happened over 6 months ago with protests, both in support of the war and against it. The pro-Palestine students and faculty members have been calling for their universities to divest from corporations that profit from Israel, which has now killed more than 35,000 people and injured at least 77,000. As of May 2nd, more than 1,600 students and faculty members have been arrested in the United States since the start of the protests. And the protests have grown violent as law enforcement agencies have tried to remove students and faculty from encampments and protest sites. We've seen students suspended, put on probation, rare cases expelled from their colleges. Some universities canceled graduation ceremonies, while others have seen their buildings, quads, and courtyards occupied by the protests, and in some cases, encampments. Even just last week, almost 1,000 graduating Harvard students walked out of their commencement Thursday morning to protest Israel and Harvard's decision to prevent 13 seniors from graduating because of their involvement in the pro-Palestine encampment. So we created this so that we could convene a panel of experts to talk about some of the core speech and other issues at the universities, to think about some of the immigration considerations for our foreign students, to discuss some of the intersections between the right to free speech and other laws, and what are some potential consequences for students engaging in protests and activism. So my first question, I'm going to start with Amol and open it up to the group, is what are we really seeing? Both what are students doing versus what universities doing? Amol, I know when we met earlier, you were saying that some colleges have handled it terribly versus some have handled it slightly less terribly. And I'd love to go into that a little bit more.
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for having me and to SABA Foundation for hosting this conversation. I think it's an important one. So what we're seeing is a broad spectrum on both sides, on the student side and on the university side. On the student side, you're seeing demonstrations of all sorts and degrees. So you're seeing things like momentary protests that happen during an hour or two. You're seeing letter writing campaigns and activism of that sort happening. You're also seeing more sustained stuff happening, including the walkouts that you mentioned, whether it's during graduation or smaller forums, even when they have speakers of a certain viewpoint or of the administration. But we're also seeing, and perhaps the most controversial of the moment is encampments, right? Like we're seeing more permanent setups of students camping out on college campuses, and doing so for periods of days, weeks, even in some cases multiple weeks. And so the university response, as you acknowledged, Suf, has been very different depending on where you sit. Of course, we saw what happened at Columbia and other schools in the New York City area where NYPD was sent in, and you saw hundreds, maybe even thousands of NYPD officers taking a pretty violent approach with students on Columbia's campus, at City College and at Fordham, and arresting hundreds of students over the course of a couple of evenings. There are also other police activities, including places like Princeton, where I'm in New Jersey, so it's close to home here. Places like Princeton where university police was called in and arrested about a dozen students during one of the protests there. They've also had a series of walkouts and other sorts of things happening. But one of the things that I wanted to pull out here in my talk at this moment was the way we saw Rutgers handle the encampment that was happening there at the New Brunswick campus in New Jersey. And what happened there was that students had set up an encampment on a quad, and they had a list of 10 demands that they wanted the school to make. That included things like divestment, included things like creating opportunities for students who were displaced as a result of the war. It included things like ongoing conversations about what's happening overseas and how Rutgers can perhaps stop using its resources towards supporting some of the things that may be happening overseas. And what I was really, scared of, I will say, is that it would turn into a situation like Columbia. And I was fearful of that moment as the ACLU head in New Jersey, thinking through what would happen if if police were called in and students were met with violent police activity at a public university in New Jersey. Thankfully, even though the threat of police violence was there, the president of Rutgers University decided to have a conversation with the students, and they ended up, negotiating. Long story short, they ended up negotiating an agreement whereby Rutgers would acknowledge and concede to about 8 of the demands that the students had, and they would engage in ongoing conversation about the others. And that resulted in the students voluntarily dismantling their encampment, and things moved on. Now, I can't say, because I'm not a student there, nor am I an administrator there, I can't say that it's a perfect resolution. But what I can say, looking in from the outside, that it was a far better resolution than what we were seeing at other places where students actually ended up getting arrested. And what I'll say, I'm sure we'll get into this more, is that Rutgers is a public university. Princeton is not. Right. Rutgers is a public university that where First Amendment rights do apply. Universities, of course, are kind of special places in some instances, and even in private colleges, there is oftentimes a commitment to free speech that's either consistent with First Amendment doctrine or even goes well beyond First Amendment doctrine, and is more protective of free speech rights than what the federal Constitution requires. And so, we have at Princeton University, thankfully, a president who's actually really good on free speech on a day-to-day basis. Of course, we saw some instances happening in recent weeks that folks can rightfully criticize, but I think there has been a history of protective free speech activity that has been pretty good at Princeton, and I'm sure at other college campuses all across the country, where, which have been for time immemorial, bastions of dissent and dialogue and innovation. And I am really proud that we have this history in the United States where college campuses, really are crucial to our democracy. And as we have been seeing, kind of meeting that engagement with law enforcement is just, in my opinion, a bad idea. And anytime we're using law enforcement for nonviolent activity, it escalates the situation. It creates a situation where students, are at jeopardy. Their safety is at jeopardy. It obviously, because we know the history of law enforcement in this country, it has a disproportionate impact on Black and Brown students. And it stifles free speech, right? And so one of the things that we are looking for at the ACLU is how universities are behaving in this moment. And even at private college campuses, as we've been saying all along, just because they can invite law enforcement doesn't mean that they should. And that's where I think a big gray area exists, right? Just because something is a legal right doesn't necessarily mean it's a smart thing to do in the context in which we're emerging. So I'll pause there, but of course I think this is a worthy conversation. I invite my colleagues to join in.
Yeah, Ahilan, Mona, anything to add?
I mean, well, first of all, also thanks very much to SABA and to both Tejas and Mona for making this happen. I'll just very briefly add that at UCLA, where I am, another important like mix in the kind of dynamics is counter protests. And in UCLA, which I think is thus far unique in the country, and we had a mob actually attack the encampment and violently assault, shoot fireworks into it, hit people with pipes. I mean, horrific stuff. And the university actually did nothing for several hours, and then at the end of that, the police eventually came and broke it up, and then let the people walk away. And only now has one person been charged in this, which is a shocking result. And then the next day, the university came in with law enforcement, massive show of force, and did sort of everything that I'm always saying is a terrible idea, to arrest all the people in the encampment. But with one of the reasons that they gave to justify this was the risk of harm to the students, which they had not done anything to deal with the night before for several hours. But then they did the following day. And I assume we'll get into the doctrine at some point, but this concept of a heckler's veto, the idea that you can point to the risk to the people who are doing the protests as a justification for shutting down the protests themselves, is sort of contrary to traditional First Amendment thought. The normal idea is if there's a safety threat to the protesters, you deal with the threat, you don't stop the protesters. But I do think that can get complicated depending on the nature of the counter protest and threat involved.
Thank you. It's interesting, Amol, I want to just flag real quickly your comment on Rutgers, because I think there would arguably members of Congress would not agree that some members of Congress that they took the right step. Is hearing the hearing last week of when the president of the university was brought forth and criticized for meeting the students even part of the way.
Yeah, that's right. There's been a lot of criticism thrown at Rutgers for engaging with the students. The president has been called a number of names. They've been said to have created an anti-Semitic environment on campus. And the data just doesn't bear that out, though, right? Like, of course, there is anti-Semitism on campus, just as there is Islamophobic or anti-Muslim behavior on campus, just as there is racism on campus. But to suggest that there is somehow an increase in anti-Semitism as a result of engaging with protesters, I think is flawed, and is just not the case. And so what we're seeing, though, is that there are more folks who support the the way in which Rutgers was able to diffuse the situation than those who oppose it. Because I think at the end of the day, everybody wants their kids to be safe on campus, their faculty and staff to be safe on campus. And what you don't want is people unnecessarily engaging with the criminal legal system or with law enforcement when there's an alternative. And clearly here, Jonathan Holloway, who's the president of Rutgers, found an alternative, engaged with the students, and it led to a productive outcome. And time will tell whether it was the right decision or whether the students will be ultimately satisfied with the way in which it was handled. But for the moment, right, it felt to me like a much better response than what other schools did when they called law enforcement in. Now, I think part of the criticism that we're seeing from members of Congress and others exists because Columbia did what it did, right? Like, so when you are a major university like Columbia University and you normalize the presence of police on campus, people will be like, why can't they just do that everywhere? And I think that's what we're seeing more of is folks trying to call for situations like at Columbia and elsewhere, and perhaps UCLA and elsewhere, where law enforcement was able to quash a protest and encampments and in the process arrest students. And I think that's a really problematic approach, as I said before, and something that does not comport with values of free speech or inclusivity that universities strive to maintain.
Thank you. Mona, even before Columbia, we had the valedictorian of USC who was not allowed to share her words, despite having earned the right to do so, right? And I think that was a couple of weeks before we started seeing these protests, encampments, and all that. What sort of consequences are you seeing for students engaging in protests and speaking out? Can you share a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you to SABA Foundation and our student organization, NASALSA, for putting this together. I think this is a really important discussion. Campus protests are not a new thing, right? They go back decades, from the start of the Vietnam War to most recently we saw a lot of protests when Roe v. Wade was overturned. So I appreciate this idea of activism, and what we were talking about earlier last week is that it really starts, I think, for many of us during our college years, this idea of activism and protesting. So what we're kind of seeing, it's really, I feel like it's very dependent on the college. Our valedictorian was then not allowed to write her, say her speech during campus. And it was a decision made out of the safety of the students and the faculty. USC, I think, like a lot of other campuses throughout the country, are seeing not only protests by students and faculty, but, we had a lot of outsiders that really were coming onto the campus. And, that's where a lot of the more violent or more extreme protesting was going on. And I think that's the same for a lot of other campuses. So it was, I think, done out of a concern for the safety of not only really the students and the faculty, but for the community as well. And I think that's where a lot of these colleges are put between a rock and a hard place, right? Where do we draw the line when it comes to safety or destruction of campus property? One person hurt is really one person too many, right? And that sometimes leads to what I think some would consider a ultra conservative view when it comes to protests, ending it early, or I think a lot of students would say, a lot of the protesters would say, actually, not being allowed to be heard. All these protests kind of happen because there's been a frustration of being allowed to be heard, or that back and forth that Rutgers, I agree with Amol, handled very well. We're not seeing that on a lot of college or campuses.
Thank you. I appreciate you saying, a lot of this is happening because people feel unheard, and a lot of my, anti-hate work, it's that so many that's where it comes from, right? People feel unheard, unseen, and as a result, they're finding different avenues to speak out. I'm curious though, and I would love your expertise from any of you is, can someone help just describe what's legal, what's not legal, what's, explain a little bit about free speech, what's allowed to be said, what's not allowed to be said. I know a lot of the students here on the call may be wondering the same thing of what can they do and what should they not be doing? Aylan, I can start with you.
Sure. I think it is important to distinguish between public and private schools, like we've sort of alluded to here. Like if you take Mona and me, for example, or maybe that's not a perfect example, in general, public universities are bound by the First Amendment. And the First Amendment creates extremely broad rules for what can be said, almost anything. The exceptions are extremely narrow. You can't make a true threat. That is not protected. You can't incite imminent lawless action, and but it has to actually be likely to happen. That imminent lawless action. So that's not protected. Almost everything else in this context in general is. There's no prohibition on advocating violence in general. The only thing is if it's specifically going to cause imminent lawless action. So you want to advocate more war in a foreign country, that's fine. There's no prohibition on racism. There's all this debate over what's anti-Semitic and what isn't, which is an important normative debate for sure. But legally, in general, it's not especially relevant, because there's no prohibition on racist speech when it comes to the First Amendment. Here, we're talking about public schools, right? There's a couple of caveats that I think are important to mention. Universities, both public and private, have an obligation to ensure that they are not creating a hostile learning environment. That's something that may be familiar to students and others, certainly from the workplace. Just like you can't have a hostile work environment. So there's some limitations, like if there's speech which is directed at a particular student that creates, that's very, sort of very targeted, that can certainly create a hostile learning environment. But the Supreme Court in multiple cases in the 70s, including about very radical, aggressive student movements, like the Student for Democratic Society, which was doing a lot of anti-Vietnam War protesting, made very clear that in general, university spaces have sort of all of the protection for the First Amendment that exists in the public sphere. If there's a difference there, it's very, very minimal. So in general, the same kind of rules that would apply outside, also apply here. There are other things which are probably really common sense that do make sense of that. Like you can't interrupt classes. Like if students come and, shout in my class so that I can't teach my class, like, similarly reasonable campus rules, but those are very, very limited exceptions. They're not based on the content of the speech. Now, when it comes to private universities, you have a different set of rules because they're not of their own force bound by the First Amendment. The First Amendment applies to state actors and not private actors. California has a rule, and this is why I say it's not a perfect example for Mona and I, because California has a rule that applies a lot of the First Amendment to private university contexts. And so in California, actually, the differences between USC and UCLA are relatively limited in terms of what the law requires, but that's as a product of state law. As far as I know, I don't think there's another state that does that, on its own terms. I don't know the law in every state, but that's quite rare. And so in a lot of other places, private universities are much less bound. In some cases, they're still bound by their own rules. And those can at times be enforceable. For example, if their own rules result in, if it breaks their own rules to censure a professor or a graduate student or something who's a graduate student worker, that could maybe create an unfair labor practice, which then could be actionable through, employment law or something like that. But it's much trickier. It's not just a straight up First Amendment prohibition like what you get at state universities. The last thing I'll say on this subject is the universities can set up neutral rules. that are called time, place, and manner restrictions consistent with the First Amendment, as can other governments. Like you can ban really loud protests in the middle of the night in a residential area because everybody needs to be able to sleep. And there's a bunch of other rules like that. And if we get into the subject of encampment specifically, I think there's a lot, you know, that you have to think about, because obviously sleeping on the grounds of a university may ban for reasons entirely unrelated to the content of the protest, right? But those rules have to be enforced neutrally. That's the basic core First Amendment rule. If you're going to make a time, place, and manner rule, it has to be something that is being set up as a neutral thing. Like we want everybody to be able to sleep, and it doesn't matter where you're there protesting in favor of Israel or against Israel or whatever. That's what and if you only enforce it on one side and not against the other, you let them tailgate before the USC UCLA game, let them camp out to buy tickets, and they camp out overnight for the basketball games, which happens all the time. Well, then you can't not allow camping because of Palestine. You know, like that kind of rule is really important. And then they also have to allow some method of other expression. So if you said no protest anywhere because we want complete quiet on our campus 24/7, 12 months of the year, that even though that's neutral, that would still be unconstitutional because it doesn't allow any possibility of protest.
Thank you. Mona or Amol, want to add to that at all?
Yeah, no, I agree with what Ahilan was saying. I think it's really up to the student. You know, you have a certain responsibility to find out the rules of your campus because, you know, I think California is kind of the exception to the overall rule. While there's a First Amendment right for public universities, that is not the case for private, you know, universities across the board. And there are some more, you know, private universities throughout the country. So it's up to you, the student, to understand what those guidelines, what those rules are. And then with that, understand, you know, what are the potential consequences to that.
Yeah, I'll echo and just underscore one thing, which is the content neutrality piece that Ahilan mentioned. You know, you look, if as Ahilan mentioned, if universities have tolerated various violations of rules up until a certain point, and then all of a sudden it gets quote unquote political, and they decide not to and start enforcing in rather harsh ways through law enforcement and other sorts of discipline, that can be really problematic. And not only is it a violation of perhaps you know the First Amendment and universities' codes of conducts if they are adopting free speech principles, it's also just a bad look. Right. Like I know universities care deeply about PR. They care deeply about what their donors and alumni think and what politicians think. And there is no winning a content specific enforcement attempt. Right. Like it gets really bad really fast. And you know, it can be called out really easily for the viewpoint based or content based enforcement that it might be.
Thank you. You know, I think most of them are not doing a good PR job, from my personal opinion. You know, we're seeing student groups be investigated, and we're talking about like what's allowed and what's not allowed. Can any of you talk a little bit dig a little bit more into the speech aspects of, on one side, you talked about neutrality, right? And I would argue a lot of students feel that responses have not been neutral towards different student groups, where some are being penalized and called out to action. So what can students do to make sure that their rights are protected, if anything?
Well, I'll start this discussion. I think it, excuse me, I think it again goes back to, you know, the students have a responsibility to kind of know the consequences, but, you know, another part of this is also, you know, what's the protest? You know, we're seeing a lot of students that are dealing with consequences when, you know, they didn't really understand what the protest was about. What were the issues? What were the goals? What were the demands? Who are they speaking to on campus? Is it a back and forth discussion? What's been the response? Have there been warnings by the institution or, you know, law enforcement? A lot of students that we are talking to now, you know, the common answer is always, well, we don't know, we didn't know. There's almost kind of a, all these people are protesting, excuse me, and there's a certain glamour behind it. Not to say that these protests aren't important and part of, I think, the, our First Amendment rights, but there is a certain responsibility on behalf of the student to determine, what am I signing up for here?
Aylan or Amal? There's a couple of Q&As which I'm going to interweave. I mean, we're seeing, I think, the consequences happen at the school, but we're also seeing consequences outside of the school, right? One person mentioned companies pledging to heavily investigate applicants for suspected anti-Semitic activity. One of you mentioned that, like, I do these Islamophobia training, and I joke with my colleague who does anti-Semitism training is that, at least with Islamophobia, we're not arguing about what the definition is. People hate Muslims, people love Muslims. There's no gray area of what Islamophobia is. But with anti-Semitism right now, there's just a lot of agreements, disagreements across sectors and lines of what that can look like. So when you have a company companies who are pledging to investigate applicants for suspected anti-Semitism activity, which includes language, what does that look like for our students? And I mean, that's a potential consequence also.
Yeah, I mean, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Eileen.
I was gonna say, we've seen this here. I have talked with some students who have been in different kinds of positions related to this. We saw it very early on with some law firms saying that they were, basically going to withdraw offers to students who had, engaged in online protest activity of different kinds. And then did that. There were some students who did have job offers withdrawn. Legally, there was some writing kind of by people about how you might kind of construct discrimination theories to challenge this. It's really tough, and again, actually, I would say California different from others. California has quite good labor code provisions that prohibit employers from trying to suppress the political activity of employees. And so, yeah, so the rules here are actually quite protective, although even there, I would say it's enforceable if they tell you, they have a meeting with you and then they withdraw the offer. So you actually know that's kind of happening, then you have a shot at enforcing it. But it's really tough to enforce this stuff, as with all employment discrimination at the hiring stage, right? Like if you apply to a job, you don't get the job, like you have no idea. It's really, really tough. And so obviously that timing kind of really matters. When you go out of California, again, I don't know every state, but I know that our rules are definitely stronger than a bunch of other states. And there aren't, I think, comparable protections almost anywhere, if anywhere. I know New York has something, but it's not quite the same. And so, yeah, I think it's an unfortunate fact that it is really difficult for law students in particular when operating in that context, that there's, especially with all the doxing and all that stuff. I know there are also online guides, things that have been done to help people understand how to protect their privacy, to prevent their information from getting out if they want to, for example, protest or go to an encampment or have an online presence that isn't easily traceable. And I know people have worked on those. I'm not an expert in that, but these are some of the things that I would think students can do to deal with that issue.
Mona?
Oh, I was going to say the same thing. We've seen, job offers revoked. We've seen even clerkships revoked. We've seen, from corporate America, this vow not to recruit from certain universities. So, we have seen that even beyond the institution level.
Mo, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think Mona was alluding to this earlier. There is a risk that a student assumes, right? Like one's rights, even if they are protected by the First Amendment, one's rights do not emerge in a vacuum, right? They are dependent on the context. If a school decides to enforce a certain thing, even though it might be in violation of the First Amendment because they haven't enforced that activity in other contexts, it doesn't mean that there aren't going to be consequences for that student, right? Like, and I think the risk that a student takes on includes, immediate disruption of their academic situation, or of the employment setting, or of other sorts of things. Now, we at the ACLU and others will fight for those rights. And as we say to people when we do know your rights trainings, when we're talking about encountering police in other contexts, the easiest thing to do in that moment to avoid risk to your safety or your life is to comply and to be polite, and then keep your mouth shut, right? Like, make sure that you are not talking to police unnecessarily. Make sure that you are asking for a lawyer if you are under arrest. Make sure that you are trying to document everything after the fact, and making sure that you're not disrupting with police activity, because that, first and foremost, our obligation to these students is to make sure that they come out safe. And I think that's really, really crucial, and something that's important. I think there is a conversation to be had about whether private institutions that adopt free speech principles should should be engaging in anything that public institutions are not engaging in, right? So I think I would say that private institutions like Princeton and others that adopt free speech principles should remain true to them, and make sure that they are doing whatever they can to protect free speech without using law enforcement, so that we're not only guaranteeing student safety, we're also guaranteeing student speech rights.
Thank you. I'm going to do a quick shift just for a little bit and touch upon potential implications for international students. And I want to make sure we're mindful of, I think we're seeing so many different types of students come out to engage on these issues. And they're not all aware of the potential risks that they may be facing. And I think international students have a double risk. Aylan, could you share some of those?
Sure. So I think international students do face some, that is, what I mean by that is students who are in school on a student visa, right? Face potentially some additional risks that's definitely worth discussing. And I think the core issue is that if you face a suspension, you're actually suspended from a school, which is one of the disciplinary outcomes, which is possible. If you violate the school's rules and then go through the disciplinary process, that in and of itself is going to be a violation of the terms of the the student visa, because being in good standing is going to be one of the conditions of maintaining that visa. Now, people drop out of standing all the time and nothing happens about it, but in a world where a university is trying to be as punitive as possible, that's definitely something that they could use as a justification to withdraw the visa. And a student visa is something which I think people don't always kind of recognize. It's kind of like a marriage visa situation, in the sense that, like, both sides have to actually want to kind of continue to operate it in order for it to continue to function. So if the school withdraws the visa, withdraws their sort of offer of ongoing admission to the student, then the visa is no longer valid. I think that's something important for people to understand. Like, weirdly, undocumented students going into protest situations are actually, I think, in many parts of the country, including certainly California, and in this place, I would also say New York, and I'm guessing almost certainly New Jersey as well. I don't recall. Are I'm almost shaking his head. Yes, are actually in a stronger position, because in jurisdictions where they don't automatically refer people to immigration upon their being arrested, as California has a policy like that, a sanctuary policy, then the likelihood that you're going to be referred to ICE and put into removal proceedings is very low, even if you're arrested. Also, at the moment, under the current administration, the enforcement priorities of ICE are such that it's very, I think, unlikely that people would be charged and go through the whole deportation process just for having been arrested on a campus if there are other it just or for being undocumented. So like the fact that you're undocumented doesn't really matter that much. But yes, as you said, I think international students in a different kind of position is a difficult set of decisions for them to make when deciding how much to get involved. I should say one other thing on the subject. Certainly at UCLA, so I was in the encampment, was very involved with a bunch of students who were there. There were plenty of opportunities to avoid arrest if you chose to do so. So which is not to say that the arrests were okay. I think I agree with Amal. I thought the university's response was outrageous, both the night before from the mob and then later from the police response. But there were, if you wanted, you could protest, participate in the encampment, do all of that, and you didn't want to get arrested. There were dispersal orders given, and a number of students did actually leave the encampment because they chose not to get arrested. And in general, police are supposed to give dispersal orders before they arrest people for failure to disperse or unlawful trespass or this kind of unlawful assembly, these kinds of offenses. And now sometimes it's true that police end up they issue that order, but then simultaneously make it impossible to leave. And people do get arrested even when they don't want to get arrested. But at least in my experience with the campus protests that I've seen, and I think the same was true at the University of California, Irvine, which went through just recently had similar smaller scale kind of arrests. People who want to get out, get out. So I think it is possible that you could be a international student, go and participate in everything, and when it gets time to looks like arrests are going to happen, then you can make your own decisions. But it's riskier. It's definitely riskier than if you're a citizen or even an undocumented person.
Thank you. I want to uplift one of the questions was one of the attendees' daughters was at the UCLA protest and was arrested and charged with the failure to disperse. They're working with public defenders, defense attorneys, but right now they're still waiting to see what the administration does. Any advice on how to proceed?
I mean, my advice for the moment would be to wait. And I say that both because the public defense system here in LA is excellent, and the public defender's office has been superb in their kind of approach to all the potential cases coming out of both USC and UCLA thus far, as far as I can tell. I mean, I know they do excellent representation generally, and from what I've seen so far, they've been, really on it with these. But the other reason I would say to wait is because there is still a very, very good chance that these offenses will not be charged. I'm not talking about the university disciplinary process. That's a different matter. But I'm talking about the charge by the police for failure to disperse and the other kind of related charges that are happening. There's lots of history of mass protests, including recent history in LA, Black Lives Matter, obviously 2020, and other ones. And often the city attorney's responses when they get 200, almost identical failure to disperse charges involving a bunch of protesters is they just dump them. They just don't pursue the charges at all. So, I think there's a really good chance that may be what happens here. If it doesn't, then obviously you can sort of reevaluate. But I would definitely wait to see before taking any other steps at the moment. In general, obviously every case could be specific. I don't want to give legal advice depending on what the particular facts are involving, that person's daughter. But in general, my approach would be just to wait and see.
Mona or Amol, anything to add?
No, I would agree with that. I think it's a wait and see type of situation. What is the university going to say? I agree. I think most of them will be dropped. So yeah, I think a wait and see approach is a good one here.
I'll just add one thing. I don't know where the attendees to this panel are from. This is a very state specific conversation to be had, right? Like, so in California or LA, or jurisdiction specific, I should say, because there might be instances where you're in an environment that's not as friendly or as tolerant of folks who are engaging in protest, and there may be amped up prosecutions as a result of that. So we want to be mindful of the fact that even though the situation might be the case that Ahilan and Mona described in California, it might not be the same in other states.
Thank you. Mona, this question is for you. A couple of our attendees are pushing back against your argument that protesting can be glamorous. Can you please expand exactly what you mean by the term glamorous?
Yeah, and I was reading these comments and questions. I think they're fair. I get what you guys are saying, and I don't mean to any offense to anyone. I will be the first to admit I thought these protests, countrywide, were actually very well organized, and what we're seeing is that student organizations, we're talking to each other from state to state to state. They were very organized. They were very organized in their demands, in their conversations. They were sharing information. So I think that those, the protesters were very organized in that way. And many of the students, they knew what the protests were about. They were asking the questions. They were getting the information. They were taking those responsibilities very seriously. This was a very passionate issue for the students that were out there. But on the flip side, we're seeing students that said, we kind of got caught up in the excitement. There were these campus-wide protests, there were these campouts, and we got caught up in it. And then we, didn't disperse when a dispersal order came, or they didn't hear the dispersal order. And so there was some regret after the fact. Again, that is not all the students. I'm just kind of, it's an extreme example that I wanted to make sure I pointed out, because I think that's part of this, right? So, not to say that is all the students. I think glamorous was probably the wrong word. I will admit. But for some of these students, they didn't quite know what they were protesting for. And I think after the fact, there was some regret there.
Aylan or Amol, anything to add? Thank you, Mona. I want to talk a little bit about media and its portrayal of it. One of my biggest critiques of the protests, while I respect and appreciate it, is I think it took away from a lot of, I'm my sister-in-law is Palestinian. I'm watching the news and social media every day about what's happening in Gaza right now. Rafah is burning, right? Like personally, I feel some of the protests took away from some of what's actually happening in Gaza right now, because the focus was on one of those. I also agree with one of these comments, and the question is, I would love to hear about your views on how mainstream media, discussed online, particularly with those with large platforms. What are you guys seeing about disinformation, misinformation, and the fairly accurate reporting of these protests? Amol, I'll start with you.
I'll just say to your point about the distraction from what's going on in Palestine and elsewhere. I think I think distraction is a political strategy, right? Like, so I think there are forces that would rather cover the controversies on college campuses, because college campuses are ground zero for demonstrations and activity and some of the things that the right and the political right in the United States really likes to criticize. I think there is a political strategy in there to allow us to focus our attention on that, so that we don't focus our attention on what's happening overseas. And so I would just be, I think any consumer of media should carry with them a healthy skepticism of what it is that they're reading, and to make sure that we're thinking about the perspective and the point of view that the reporter or the publication may be bringing to that coverage. I will say that I think there has been, I hesitate to classify as disinformation, but there's been a lot of both siding of the coverage of the protests. Like, there's been a lot of coverage of the police perspective and government perspective, and I think, in my opinion, insufficient coverage of the reason why people are protesting in the first place. there's there's a tactic of taking quotes out of context or putting on camera repeatedly an uninformed or less informed protester to make them look foolish or naive. And I think that those are all parts of strategy here that I think are sort of emblematic of a bigger picture. One thing I'll also zoom out on is how this is all related to other things that are happening in society, right? It's not just that all of a sudden we have this emergence of protests because of what's happening overseas. This is like, just months ago in December, we had the congressional hearing of the university presidents that resulted in two of those presidents either resigning or having to leave their jobs. And I think it's all sort of swirling around with quote unquote wokeness and the DEI conversations and the ways in which we are engaging in what's called culture wars in the United States and book bans. Like all of this stuff is sort of related or sides of the same die. And I think there is at the core of it an attempt to undermine some core democratic values that we hold dear, and related to those core democratic values, only allow for certain freedoms to be applied when people are of a certain identity, right? I think it all kind of comes back to identity and race and democracy.
Thank you. Mona?
I have nothing to add to that. I completely agree with all that. I think, the media in a lot of ways, they want the sensationalized soundbite and they play it over and over and over again. And, I tend to agree there, at least here in California, the sound bites that I listen to talk radio quite a bit. We've heard from the campus perspective, the police perspective, the government perspective. I haven't seen a lot of students interviewed. It's been very, very, very little. I can, maybe count 2 or 3 since this has all been going on that I've heard interviews from actual students. So I do think, there's a certain sensationalization from the other side.
Island?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like your question asked me to take my legal advice hat off and, my sort of critical viewer hat on, which I'm happy to do, but, just with the caveat that I don't know anything more about this than anybody else, but I mean, I have a few thoughts. One, if you take what happened at UCLA as a paradigm, and that's obviously what I followed most closely, I've been appalled by the coverage over it and what I'm gonna call both sides of them. I mean, the mob attack, you read the initial accounts of it, they really sound like there was just a fight that broke out between counter protesters and protesters. But then when the video evidence and all the kind of detailed look comes in, that's not at all what happened. Even from eyewitness reporters who were there, some of them were excellent, but many of them were really atrocious and described it as two sides fighting, when in fact it was a mob attacking, a bunch of students who tried very hard to stay unarmed, and a mob of outsiders, primarily people who are not students. And I am very skeptical that was how it would have been reported if it was like a mob of, pro-Palestinian, people attacking a peaceful, encampment of students supporting Israel's right to exist or something like that. So I'm very skeptical of, I mean, I think you see that, and you see that throughout in the media, and it's really hard to kind of counteract that, On the distraction thing, I don't know. I mean, I guess part of me thinks that the ultimate goal of the protesters, I don't know, I'm not a SJP or FJP person or anything, but like from what I can tell, it seems to be to put pressure on the Biden administration. And the Biden administration obviously has a huge amount of leverage to influence Israel's conduct of the conflict, and they're doing that. I mean, they sure look like they're doing that. I mean, it's become a huge problem in the Democratic Party all over the country, and protesters attacking, Democratic politicians to sort of force them to take a position on this. Even in the hearings, Ilhan Omar was very aggressively questioning the chancellor of UCLA, I don't know, boss's boss or something. And I think so. So I'm not sure that it is. I mean, it's definitely distracting in that they're covering the protests as much as they're covering the conflict itself. But on the other hand, if the goal is not to influence coverage, but instead to create political pressure on the government, it seems to be doing that to some degree. The last thing I'll say about it is I think now, as for a long, long time, there is really a lack of nuance in describing what counts as anti-Semitism. And I think underlying it at all is a difficulty of dealing with the problem that if someone says, like, I oppose there being a state that gives a preferential place to the religion of Judaism and people who practice it, right? Like, this is a long-held view amongst a lot of people, long predating Hamas, right? Like people who believed that there should be essentially like one multi-religious, party democracy in all of that place. Is that view anti-Semitic or not? And do you classify it that way? I think that part of the problem is that you also have a whole lot of other people, and these are the people who run Gaza or who ran Gaza before the war started, who like Hamas, right? Who don't have that view. They believe in an Islamist state, and that the only people who should be allowed to kind of or whether whoever can live in it, that it has to be run by people who fundamentally theocratic kind of view. And now you've got both these things operating. And so when you have a chant like "From the River to the Sea," some people who chant it, know its history from before Hamas, and I think that's what they intend. They intend, nobody should have been expelled. We should have all been allowed, meaning no Palestinians should have been expelled. We should all have been allowed to live here. Other people, I think, mean that chant to mean like, ethnic cleansing. Basically, all the Jewish people should be, chased out of Israel. And many other people are just chanting it because it's part of the set of chants, and they don't think about the details of the political content of what's in that chant. And so because of that, I think it's really, really hard. You see the chant of, people, a lot of the congressional testimony, like, it's anti-Semitic to chant "From the River to the Sea." And I think, that many people who chant it and have an understanding of this would say, no, it's not, and then, but what do you do with this? It's really kind of intractable problem. So I think, that definitely clouds so much of the discussion of this and makes it a kind of a mess, and it makes it, just really hard to get kind of an accurate kind of account of what's actually happening and all the like underlying kind of social phenomena.
I appreciate you saying that, especially on "For the River to the Sea" comment, because now that Congress has said that that's anti-Semitic, anytime and anywhere that that's used can be used as like, this is an anti-Semitic protest or rally or a post or whatnot, right? Which has its, I mean, we could spend hours just talking about additional problems that can raise constitutionally too. We're about time. I want to give Mona and Amol any last thoughts to share as well. Mona?
Yeah, first of all, thanks, everyone for putting this together. I think it's so relevant, not just with what's going on now, but for, I think, decades to come. My final thoughts are, keep up this idea of activism. I think activism is so important, and especially at the college, university level, I think it's a core part of that experience. But be smart about it, understand, what the protest or the activism is about. What are, the potential consequences to your particular institution? We're seeing consequences anywhere from, slap on the wrist to expulsion to legal consequences such as being arrested or legal financial penalties, to, for our foreign students, like we alluded to, even possible deportation, right? So understand those consequences. What are the protests for? Understand, what are we protesting for? What are the issues? What are the topics? What are the goals? Who are people communicating with? Is there a dialogue back and forth? I think that's also really important. So, keep up this idea of activism, and be safe. I think one of the best pieces of advice that I've heard for college students is, to deal with the consequences, you have your camera, you have your cell phone, document things just for your own personal thing. If you do get arrested, if you do have disciplinary actions, you can, turn on your camera, turn on your video, and you have that. So keep that with you. I thought that was a really good piece of advice.
Thank you, Mona. Amol?
Yeah, I'll just say, one thing that I know might be unsatisfactory is that there are a lot of consequences as a result of these protests that happen to students that may not have clean legal solutions. So I saw some questions in the chat about what to do if an employer rejects an applicant or investigates an applicant, as Aylan mentioned before and as Mona mentioned before. Some of these there may not be a legal solution to these issues, and I will say that over time I think there needs to be simultaneous political pressure and cultural change, which will hopefully change the way we perceive of this college activism that's happening right now. Look, it was activism that led to same-sex marriage being accepted in the United States. It was activism that led to the Civil Rights Act being passed in the United States. It was activism and campus activism in particular that led to an awareness of some of the national security atrocities that we were seeing in the post 9/11 and period, and then a bunch of other periods throughout our history. And so I think it's important for us to keep up the activism, as Mona was saying, because it does work, right? Like, it leads to political change and cultural change and broad-based awareness of a problem that people may not be aware of from before. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Amo, Mona, Aylan, thank you so much for sharing your words and for joining us today. I'll pass it back to Tejas.
Well, thank you, Sufyan, and thanks for everyone joining and making this such an interactive conversation. We are past the hour, so we're going to go ahead and end the webinar, but we're grateful for everybody's participation and hope to have similar programming in the future as well. So thanks again. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.